Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shruti Lal, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all
to the first debate of the season, the Green Trade Debate. And in a short while, you will witness an intelligent and a fierce debate from the students of the Graduate Institute on CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and whether or not it is discriminatory towards developing nations. This is hosted by the Geneva Trade Platform and the Geneva Debate, the initiative of the Geneva Graduate Institute that gives students a platform to debate and discuss the most pertinent issues of our time, and we, as inheritors, how its consequences are going to affect us. So I welcome you all to this debate, and to everyone watching us live wherever you are, and my parents, if you're watching. Please don't text me during the debate. I'm honored to welcome our esteemed jury for this day. Let me start off with Dr. Rashmi Banga. Dr. Rashmi is a Senior Economic Affairs Officer on the Unit on Economic Cooperation and Integration among Developing Countries, UNCTAD. She is a former advisor and head of trade competitiveness in the Commonwealth Secretariat and has provided policy support to more than 30 countries. She has worked as a senior economist in DFID-funded UNCTAD's project, which provided support to the Indian Ministry of Commerce in its trade negotiations. She was an associate professor of economics of JNU, Delhi, and has been awarded the International Economic Development Research Award by the Export-Import Bank of India, and has been the recipient of not one, but two awards, gold medals for her research on globalization and development from Global Development Network, World Bank. So thank you, Dr. Rashmi, for accepting our invitation. Next on, Yasmin Ismail is a program officer at CUTS International Geneva, an NGO catalyzing the pro-trade, pro-equity voices of the Global South in trade and development debates in Geneva. In addition to leading CUTS's research and technical assistance projects for Geneva delegations of developing countries on the digital economy since 2019, Yasmin acts as CUTS's Geneva focal point to the UNFCCC and the stakeholder network of the trade and environment sustainability discussions in the WTO. That said, Yasmin has been actively contributing to Geneva debates on trade and climate change linkages and the analysis of trade-related climate measures from the perspective of developing countries. Yasmin, I hope this debate is insightful to you and it brings about some fresh and young perspectives that will help you in your work as well. And last, but of course not least, Rashid Kaukab sir is a senior specialist in trade and sustainable development at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, IISD. He has worked as a counselor on trade and economic issues in the Pakistan mission to the UNWTO in Geneva from 1995 till 1998. He was with the South Center from 1998 to 2007 as coordinator of the South Center Work Program on Trade and Development, as the head of the Strategic Policy and Planning, and as the head of the Program and Research Coordination. He was also with UNCTAD as a senior consultant, and he worked for CUTS International from 2008 till early 2023, including as its executive director from 2012 till 2023. Rashid sir, we're thrilled to have you. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And now, before I proceed into the rules of the procedure, let me take a good moment to express my love and my gratitude to my amazing team over here. So at the outset, I thank my kindest professors at the Graduate Institute for their insight and their assistance in helping us frame this balanced motion, which you will see in a bit. I'm not from the Confluence of Trade nor Climate. My research is in migrations and refugee studies. But when this opportunity was presented to me, I reached out to a couple of my professors, and they were so kind, and they offered me innumerable insights on whatever is happening at the WTO. And you guys are doing some great work over here, which I did not know prior to this forum. And my special thanks goes out to Marius, a PhD researcher in international law, who has been more than generous in giving us his time, especially to the debaters over here in answering their every technical question. Thank you so much, Marius. We really appreciate it.
And I'm grateful to our directrice, Marie Lossal, for her constant support and encouragement for all the aspirations of the Geneva debate. To Bhavya Kapoor, our comms director, thank you, Bhavya, for working with me throughout the summer to make this into what it is right now. And to our debate coach, Sohini, who is watching us from Delhi, thank you for training our debaters over the last month. And our volunteers for the day, Rennie over here, Anuj, Sibisish, and our photographer, Argdeep. First-year students, thank you for volunteering your time with us. I really appreciate it. And of course, to the team at the WTO, the public forum. Javier, thank you so much for letting our proposal come through. It is an absolute pleasure to be doing this as students for the first time, and we hope to keep this a tradition. And last, but never the least, the man who gave us this opportunity to host this debate, the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, Dimitri, who is sitting on the edge over there, but he should be right there in the middle. Thank you, Dimitri. Being around Dimitri, if you do not know him, please go say hello. I'm sure you all know him. I don't think he's an easy person to miss, but I've learned so much from Dimitri over the past month, from his very evocative conversational style to his suave professionalism. It was an absolute pleasure to just be around and learn lots. So thank you so much, Dimitri. And you are our favorite patron of the Geneva debate. And now, let us get down to business. I will be presenting the rules of procedure for this particular debate. It can vary from debate to debate. Due to time constraints for this one, we have decided to proceed with a modified Asian parliamentary debate. And this means that the Prime Minister will start the debate in a bit, and it will end with the government whip giving her speech. Every speech will be 5 minutes long, and during these constructive speeches, the opposing side will have an opportunity to raise their hand or speak into their mic to present a point of information, which will be a very brief, a short question and not a statement. And the speaker will have, it is up to his or her discretion to accept or reject that point of information. But please note that you can only ask a POI at every 20 seconds to make sure that we have some calm over here and it's not disrupted. At the end of the debate, reply speeches will comprise of 3 minutes each. 3 minutes of reply speech is intended to review the major issues of the debate and to leave a lasting impression in the minds of the audience. And a reply speaker goes over the various arguments that have already been occurred throughout various speeches, but this is to imply that their side has actually won. And since this is a biased adjudication, it will not be graded. It's different from a constructive speech. And this will commence after the teams have been provided with 1 minute at the very end of the constructive debate. And the criterion, our debaters over here for the day, today they will be marked on matter, which is the substance of your speech. This is the quality of your arguments and the evidence that you're going to present. The method. This is how you are responding to the dynamism of the debate that's going to take place, how effective you are in using not only your debate, your arguments, but also the arguments of the opposing side, and the presentation of your own arguments using logical flow and coherent structure. And of course, we come to manner, which is the style of your delivery, how engaging, and most importantly, how persuasive you are to the audience and to our jury members over here. And of course, the decision of the jury, whether it is unanimous or split, that is final. And rest assured, I'm very excited to see what they have to say for this debate. And with this, I declare the green trade debate open. Yes. And I invite the Prime Minister to make her opening remarks.
The weakening of the World Trade Organization and the increasing weaponization of trade has forced us to equip ourselves with industrial policy instruments to re-establish a level playing field and to reduce excessive dependencies which could be weaponized. This is the European Union's climate strategy in the EU's own words. Good afternoon, my name is Elena, and together with my fellow speakers, Myrtle and Mona, we believe that the carbon border adjustment mechanism is discriminatory towards developing nations. We, as the proposition, consider discrimination to be the inequitable imposition of a debatable environmental policy onto developing nations. Today, my speech will display how the CBAM is discriminatory as it contradicts its overarching objective in two ways. Firstly, we will show how this supposed climate mechanism actually hinders its own environmental protection goals. Second, we will focus on the proposed use of revenues from the mechanism and how it parallels a dependency theory model and perpetuates further inequity. Myrtle will later address the CBAM's economic discrimination and historically rooted dependency patterns the Global South has faced and how this prevents the CBAM's promised green transitions. And Mona will extend these arguments, present a countermodel, and rebut. Firstly, the CBAM is discriminatory because it contradicts its own alleged climate-based goals. If the CBAM primary goal was to fight carbon leakage and help others achieve their own climate goals, and I'm quoting, then the staple point of the whole policy should have been to co-design partnerships that prioritize developing nations' economic transformations first and foremost. Instead, not only did the European Commission categorically exclude any kind of exemption for least developed countries, for instance, but it also did not provide any kind of specific investment plan for their green transition, apart from general and, at this point, quite unreliable promises, especially given the fact that the revenues from the mechanism have recently been allocated to the EU budget. This clashes quite soundly with the image of a CBAM as a political leveraging tool to incentivize all the parties of the Paris Agreement towards a strengthened joint climate action, and actually reminds us of a modus operandi already seen. EU-Asian 2022 deforestation law, a forward-looking policy which had to act as a catalyst for the transition from biofuels to renewable energy, ended up becoming the start of a diplomatic war, with Malaysia and Indonesia filing lawsuits at the World Trade Organization, refusing to accept the EU's climate policy interventions altogether, and stalling high-level negotiations such as the EU-Asian Strategic Partnership. All of this undermined efforts by both Malaysia and Indonesia to mainstream sustainability certifications and programs into the palm oil industries, and therefore actively prevented the sustainable transition, both of the sectors and of their economies. But let's now focus on the discriminatory use of CBAM's revenues. Once again, an actually climate-informed policy would focus specifically on Global South countries, which have historically been excluded from low-carbon technological development, not only in terms of hardware and capital flows, but also in terms of private investments and intellectual ownership. Even when Global North countries provide development aid, although never actually reaching the $100 million per year target they committed to also in the Paris Agreement, they do so by focusing on transferring hardware rather than software, which will help clean technology diffuse, but not encourage indigenous innovation capacities. Concluding, my above points perfectly encapsulate the different layers of discrimination unilateral measures such as the CBAM implicate by infringing on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, misdirecting the very notion of substantive equality the principle is grounded in. The CBAM disregards developing nations' historical contributions, gives in to the discriminatory dependency patterns they are already subjected to, and by hindering the foundation for the equitable and not just equal distributions of the cost of global environmental protection, actively prevents their sustainable development. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now invite the leader of the opposition,
A catastrophic storm caused by climate change killed about 2,000 people in Libya on Monday. The locals say there are bodies everywhere. Only a few weeks ago, we saw temperatures 14 degrees Celsius above normal here in Geneva. We all are in a state of global climate emergency. Developing countries are the most vulnerable to climate change, and climate change is questioning the very existence of some of the small and island and developing states. Now, CBAM is a measure to reduce carbon leakage. It is a step towards a greener economy for mitigating such catastrophes. Today, as the leader of opposition, I will first justify how CBAM is not discriminatory, then how CBAM respects the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and finally, the benefits of CBAM for developing countries. Many of my responses to the Prime Minister will be integrated in this speech. My first point, CBAM is not discriminatory towards developing nations. CBAM is putting the same price on the total carbon emissions of goods, whether they are imported or produced within the EU. So it is not discriminating between the countries within or outside the EU. It is not giving national treatment. Coming to my second point for today, CBAM respects the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. How? CBAM does not put a cap on the emissions of imported goods, whereas emissions of industries within the EU are capped by the EU's emissions trading system. It is very important for us to understand that CBAM does not force the developing countries to decarbonize their entire domestic production. It does not affect the goods they produce for their own development. It also does not affect the exports made by developing nations to countries other than the EU. This policy only governs the exports made to the EU and only for the 6 specified goods. Now, the developing nations can also choose to introduce domestic carbon pricing measures specifically for their exports to the EU. And this can help them retain their tax revenue within their country because CBAM has a provision to waive off the import tariff for any country which has its own domestic carbon pricing. So CBAM is also not giving most favored nation treatment here. The actual cash out cost for businesses will begin in January 2026. So developing nations and their manufacturers will have 2.5 years from now to prepare for it. And we must also note that according to IPCC, by that time, we will have already crossed the 1.5 degrees Celsius target of the Paris Agreement. My third and final point for today is that are the benefits of CBAM for developing countries. CBAM reduces carbon leakage, and this is a good news for developing countries because historically, developing countries and their vulnerable populations have been exploited by foreign multinationals. Manufacturing plants of cement, iron, aluminium, and fertilizers operated by MNCs have severely polluted land, water, and air in the developing world. CBAM also helps accelerate climate change mitigation globally. If CBAM is not there, global economy does not decarbonize fast enough to effectively mitigate climate change, and as a consequence, extreme weather events will become more and more frequent and cause severe economic and social damages, pushing the developing nations decades back on their development agenda. According to World Meteorological Organization, 2 developing nations, just 2, Pakistan and India, lost a total of $19.2 billion due to extreme weather events within the last year. This loss is more than 3 times of what UNCTAD estimates would be the loss in income for developing countries due to CBAM. Now, if we say that CBAM will do a great harm to developing countries, we should ask to what extent? Because CBAM, according to UNCTAD, will affect only 1.4 to 2.4% of the exports of CBAM goods for the developing nations. And they will not suffer a decline in their exports. I would now like to address some of the arguments made by Madam Prime Minister here. And one is that LDC should be given an exemption. But if LDCs are given an exemption, they will be a part of the carbon leakage and the industries will move there. And then the carbon emissions would reflect on their national accounts. Second, I would just would like to give her a point about the financial use of finances and financial assistance. The EU, its member states, and the European Investment Bank are together the biggest contributor of public climate finance to developing economies, providing 23.04 billion in 2021 itself. Now, we say that ideally all nations should bring a global carbon pricing system. Then there will be no carbon leakage and no need for CBAM-like measures. But in the absence of this system, for now, CBAM is a well thought out and fair system of carbon pricing. We must support its implementation and decarbonize our economies quickly. Thank you so much.
I now invite the Deputy Prime Minister to present her speech.
Lack of understanding about the heart of this debate. They simplistically equate equality to equity, and we, the proposition, hope to show you why this is wrong and why, based on this, the carbon border adjustment mechanism is indeed discriminatory towards developing nations. My name is Meto, and I will do three things: rebut, detail the mechanism's discriminatory nature, and summarize. Firstly, the opposition have peddled that the mechanism is going to save the climate by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. However, according to an UNCTAD report in 2021, it will only have a projected 0.1% drop in global CO2 emissions. Why are the opposition comfortable in making false promises? Secondly, the opposition mentioned that the mechanism is fair as the guidelines are the same for all participatory nations. However, they fail to complexify the context by considering differentiated capability. We agree that the goal is the same, to reduce carbon emissions, but can the opposition truly state that the capabilities to do so are the same? And if they do, they are choosing to be willfully inconsiderate of historical, social, and economic complexities, which I will now further expand upon in the first argument. This House believes that the mechanism is discriminatory against developing nations as it economically privileges some nations while penalizing others. The mechanism states that depending on a developing country's exporting mix, the EU tariff could be higher. For example, imports from India would contend with a 4% tariff, and as the carbon price increases, so would the tariff. Additionally, according to the Global Center for Development, Mozambique's GDP would decrease by 1.5% due to the tariffs on aluminium exports alone. Furthermore, the opposition described the mechanism as not discriminatory as it has the same tariffs for both non-EU and EU countries. However, we should view this mechanism with a critical lens that engages with differentiated capability. We should not equate equality with equity. Just because on paper the guidelines are the same doesn't mean in reality they affect participatory nations in the same way. Can the opposition honestly say that this policy will affect Germany, rejected, and a smaller developing nation with an emerging economy in the same manner? Thirdly, the mechanism will apply to imports of concerned products, except when a country falls under the general country exemption. The second annex to the mechanism lists our very own Switzerland as one of the countries that would not have to comply with the mechanism because it has its own ETS, emission trading system. The crux of our argument as the proposition is that the mechanism also perpetuates a culture of exceptionalism that exempts specific nations and instead uses developing nations as economic scapegoats. We accept the proposition's stance that all countries should accept responsibility for tackling the climate threat. However, it is discriminatory and unreasonable to legitimately expect developing countries to shoulder the same economic burden as developed nations who have historically contributed to a larger share of cumulative carbon emissions. As the proposition, we believe that this mechanism operates as a drop in the ocean of policies that dictates to developing nations how they should conduct their own developmental practices. Secondly, the mechanism is discriminatory as it further perpetuates a historical precedence of dependency, as briefly mentioned by my colleague Elena. Supporters of the mechanism note that revenues generated can be used towards further development of green technology in developing nations. However, as exhibited by Elena, this has not been historically likely, and the proposal today does not actually include any legitimate plans of how this is going to be enacted. Can the opposition address this? Instead, the revenues generated are more likely to be used to further fuel the concentration of investment in green technology in developed nations, and this is the same technology that developing nations will now have to pay to use, further perpetuating a culture of dependency. According to Peyo et al., the lack of access to low carbon tech for developing nations remains a stumbling block for UN climate negotiations, and calls for low carbon tech transfer, including discussions of compulsory licensing, have been strictly opposed by the US and the EU. The same EU who the opposition wants you to believe are going to magnanimously gift their own generated revenues toward developing nations' green development. We know better. The reality is this mechanism would further segregate climate development, as developing nations will now be made to beg for scraps of green technology developed from revenue they funded, from tariffs they were made to pay, to support economies they are not a part of. How is this not discriminatory? In conclusion, this House believes that the carbon border mechanism is discriminatory. Firstly, due to the economic inconsistencies that favor some nations and negate others. Secondly, it exacerbates a historical precedence of dependency that segregates climate development, disproving the opposition's contribution of the mechanism as a tool for unilateral climate development. We should ask ourselves, who gets to manufacture this policy? Who gets to be exempt? And ultimately, who has to answer to this economic big brother? Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. I now invite the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to make her arguments.
Climate change is fueling mass migration. Ladies and gentlemen, members of this jury, in this context, when we speak of development, what does it mean when millions of people are losing their lives as well as their lands? The proposition referred to Mozambique. We would like to put forth one particular point, which is in 2022, one single cyclone in Mozambique affected more than 736,000 people. There were many such cyclones. We ask you, what is the impact of these extreme weather events? What has climate change led us to? In this context, we believe that the CBAM is a fair policy that is dedicated towards ensuring that we mitigate the efforts of climate change as much as possible, and it is non-discriminatory. I would like to first start off by saying that the CBAM does not provide any exemptions. What it does is to merely put forth a carbon pricing for emissions and allows for countries to have their own carbon pricing systems as well. There is no exemption. It is an incentive for countries themselves to have their own carbon systems. And I will take that later. Thank you. An example of this would be according to UNFCCC, where about 100 countries are considering the use of a carbon pricing system to achieve their emission reduction targets under the Paris Agreement. We see this is a global conversation. We see that there is a need for a carbon pricing system. There are so many countries around the world who are working towards it. And we understand that the CBAM is a transitionary measure that acts as an initiative for these countries to have these conversations and bring their own systems in place. Further, according to World Bank, more than 70 jurisdictions around the world are already putting a price on their carbon emissions. This is the need of the hour, and we see that all nations are stepping up and taking responsibility. Ladies and gentlemen, we, the opposition, understand the situation of developing countries and least developed countries, which is why we are saying that there should be no exemption. What happens if there's an exemption? Multinational corporations carry out their production in these countries, thereby ensuring that there are more emissions in this place, out of which they are the ones that are going to be affected. This is why there is a system in place for both technical assistance as well as financial assistance. The proposition spoke about just the promises that EU has making. We believe that these are not mere promises. These have been actionable, as evidenced by the fact that there is a green climate fund that was set up in 2010 to help developing economies reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to climate change. Since 2014, the EU countries have pledged over $4.7 million. We ask you, ladies and gentlemen, are these mere promises, or do we see action from developed countries? We see developed economies take a step up, contribute to their financing, ensuring that all of us can take global responsibility and can lead a global action towards mitigating climate change. Further, there was a talk about how we should co-design a partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, we do not deny the fact that there is a need for a global carbon pricing system. However, till that is in place, we do need a transitionary measure in place whereby the EU can ensure that it reduces the emissions in its own region as well as the emissions that it is responsible for when they're importing from countries. Therefore, what the CBAM will lead to is a global conversation. We already see countries like India that are having discussions with the EU on CBAM. Why is this happening? Because we see that countries do see the need. And ladies and gentlemen, we do not undermine the capacity of developing countries to have their own indigenous innovation as well. There is still scope for them to ensure that they can grow greener as well as support their own innovations. Further, what this policy does is to put a carbon tariff on production that they are using to export to the EU. It does not in any way impose a regulation on their domestic production or on the production that they are carrying out to export to other countries. Those are still within their control. It is their authority, and the EU is not interfering in that. We understand that historically, there have been events that have ensured that developing countries have not been able to develop as much as other countries. However, we do see that there are reparations being made. We ask you, ladies and gentlemen, what is the world that we are fighting for? With so much there is mass migration due to climate change, people are losing their lives and lands. We believe that this world is worth fighting for, and we believe that we should lead this change together. And that is what the CBAM represents. Thank you.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and now invite the Government Whip to present her final arguments.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I will be rebutting what our colleagues have spoken before me. To address the concern over numbers, and it seems like we're comparing statistics and numbers here. High-income countries have 81% of green investment funded by the private sector, whereas in emerging and developing countries, the private share is a mere 14%. It is highly unlikely, even with a successful outcome in this debate, that this number will fill it. Global expenditure on aid is even less than 1/10 of the cost of the green transformation. Moreover, developing countries do not have the space on their balance sheets for the debt required, even if they wish to finance it themselves. Right before CBAM was happening, studies concurred that Africa, as the continent, for example, has 60% of the world's best photovoltaic solar resources, but has only 1% of the world's installed capacity. Emerging economies must have access to finance that will allow them to meet the aspirations of their populations and government, while avoiding high emissions development pathways. The cost of capital for a typical solar PV, as suggested, is 2 to 3 times higher in developing markets. And for example, middle to low income countries account for 14% of overall investment in 2017, but actually represent only 41% of the world's population. By contrast, high income countries, representing less than 15% of the population, received more than 40% of investment volumes. And this is if you want to talk about numbers. Now, the second point was reiterated over and over again, which it began by saying that CBAM does not cap certain industries. But let me debunk this. Based on the discussion so far, the problem is in the implementation. The Commission's own impact assessment finds that the costs for compliance are likely to be substantial. Indeed, they may be prohibitive for small and medium-sized enterprises so that the default values will apply. However, they also may be high enough that a substantial number of larger firms also opt out for the default rate. And now, if this happens, the compliance costs linked to the scheme will force a failure to actually realize cross-border improvement in emissions outcomes. Firms will then just pay the default rate just like any other tax, and any intended climate-related outcomes will be sterilized. In essence, the effectiveness of this dimension of the measure depends on several factors, which were not necessarily brought in your speeches. The first is meeting the administrative burden of compliance costs. The second is actual adaptation costs to qualify for a reduced CBAM fee. Given these costs, ladies and gentlemen, the benefit of a feasibly reduced rate relative to the default rate must justify adaptation costs and proof of adaptation. Finally, because the measure does not address the full complexity of modern value chains, which include indirect embodied emissions, such as emissions from electricity used to make steel, higher costs might just create an incentive to move upstream activities offshore. And now I will be providing the counter model introduced initially by my teammates. Keeping in mind that the proposition recognizes that the agreement's reporting obligations commence in 2 weeks. Our counter model, therefore, designed to fit in with the possible future implementing acts. We begin by calling for a transparent and reconstructed act regarding the use of revenues. So far, CBAM only suggests that the most revenues will accrue to the EU budget. Before any question arises, CBAM may be compliant with Article 20 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, specifically sections B and G, if these revenues end up being used for green transition. This is yet to be confirmed in paper. Even then, it does not meet the chapeau requirements of Article 20 by keeping the revenues for internal green transitions and thus discriminating against foreign producers and nations exposed to the same carbon pricing mechanism. Therefore, the application of the measure in both early and following implementation phases must occur in accordance with basic and fairness and due process requirements. And I want to end by saying that the opposition loses this debate because they have failed to mention any long-term events, any long-term effects of CBAM, but the overarching principle that we want to stop climate change. This is not something that we are debunking. This is not something that we do not want as the government. Obviously, everyone here is at stake, but you did not respond adequately to our plans on investment, greener transitions. You threw numbers, but none of these numbers were actually backed up by anything, by any projects. Nor did you address Myrtle's points on the historic point, the historic precedence of this. You have said that, yes, it has happened before, but it won't happen again. We have heard this from the EU before. What else can you offer us? Thank you.
Thank you, Government Whip. And now invite the opposition whip to make her final statements.
Okay, my speech starts in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, now there's a great cost of inaction. Climate change is accelerating, and developing countries will be the most affected. We see in today's debate from opposition, what is truly discriminatory is to economically benefit from offshoring by moving the polluting industries to developing countries while doing nothing and leaving them to the brunt of incoming climate change. 3 things in my speech today. First of all, a big weighing on the practicality. And secondly, let's talk about common but differentiated responsibility. And lastly, about WTO's non-discrimination rule. But before that, 2 responses to the previous speaker. First of all, I think there's a false understanding as to what differentiated responsibility actually means. We're not denying that there will be cost. But the thing here is the burden of opposition is not to prove that all the costs will be covered by EU or by developed countries, but to prove that by giving funding and technical support, we guarantee that the less developed countries will shoulder less responsibility. And I will show you that further in my speech. Second response, they accuse us of not proving any long-term effects. But we tell you, even the data they gave, the 0% of reduction in carbon emissions. What does really mean? It means the combination of carbon emissions of Swiss and Denmark in total is not a small number. It has effects on daily life, on our global efforts to combat climate change. And also, let's think of other long-term benefits. What we're having now, the discussion on CBAM, the discussion of having a new global carbon pricing system, the discussion of having urgently move towards a greener future. That's the effect we actually expect and are experiencing from CBAM right now. Now let's talk about the first thing, a bit weighing on practicality. To be very clear, we're not denying that there will be negative impacts for developing countries in the short term. But there's 3 reasons why this is still less desirable than having CBAM in the end of the day. Firstly, regarding the magnitude of costs. So my partners have given you many data I will not repeat here. But the takeaway here is, even if developing countries can economically develop in the short term, but if there are climate crisis, all the progress, all the development can be easily cancelled out.
We think this is a huge cost that we need to act upon it right now. And secondly, in regarding the irreversibility. So under CBAM, developing countries still have the opportunity to develop. As we say, there's no cap on the carbon emissions for developing countries, and there will be financial and technical support. But in comparison, the harms of climate crisis will be irreversible. Just think of the lives that caused in climate crisis. And third thing, if you want to talk about development, yeah, that's all right. But ladies and gentlemen, international competitiveness is going to be governed by sustainability. This means countries relying on carbon intensive industries will be more costly. This means carbon intensive industries will create less GDP than proposition today seems to assume. This also means that we should prioritize CBAM over the short-term benefits, which will be even less in the long run, when all countries are moving towards a greener future and are thinking of domestic carbon pricing system. Second thing, about differentiated responsibility. Okay, I think what we disagree in today's debate is what kind of differential treatments we want. Proposition wants exemption. We say no, because this will lead to the exact same problem we want to address with CBAM, the carbon leakage. And Mohit has proven in his speech that carbon leakage is more damaging to developing countries than to developed countries. What we offer from opposition is we have transitional period during which the developing countries can be prepared, and especially with the guidance and technical training from EU. And B, we tell you there's no cap on carbon emissions from developing countries. But in comparison, within EU, on EU countries, there are actually caps imposed by the ETS. And last but not least, we have funds and technical support. We admit it's not in the form that proposition wants, i.e. using the revenue from CBAM. But EU has been doing is to contribute billions to public climate finance and also green climate funds and other projects that is dedicated to developing countries and LDCs. We say this is compatible with a common but differentiated responsibility. So let's move on. Lastly, regarding the WTO's non-discrimination rule. So once again, I think both speakers from opposition teams have proven that this actually all carbons within and without EU will be priced. So there's no discrimination. To sum up today's debate, we think the concerns from proposition is legit. But the thing here is, it's time we act right now, or there will be no future for everyone. Proud to oppose.
Thank the opposition whip. And now we have 1 minute for each team to prepare their reply speeches. If our jury is done marking our debaters, I request Bhavya to collect the mark sheets. Thank you, Bhavya. I now invite the opposition to present their reply speech. And please note that this is for 3 minutes and there are no points of information that are allowed.
Hello. Yeah. I would bring to the notice of the proposition that they have not considered at all the developments which are happening in the developing countries on their own carbon pricing methods. So if we look at the data of the World Bank and the top 15 developing countries, which would be the most affected by CBAM, based on their exposure of the CBAM to their total GDP, we find that 2 of them already have a carbon tax in place. 2 of them are considering ETS. 6 of them have mentioned that they would consider carbon pricing or carbon market mechanisms in their NDCs. And 3 have mentioned that they would actively adopt low carbon technologies for their manufacturing processes. So it is very important for us to understand. And also, if you want to mention LDCs, then Senegal is also actively considering to build their own carbon pricing system. So it's very important for us to understand that there is a global trend for adoption of carbon pricing. CBAM is a transitional measure. We have to also understand that the cost of climate change will be much, much higher than the cost the developing countries will be facing because of CBAM. This is a transitional period for the CBAM as well, and the actual cost will come in January. The reportings will begin in October this year, January 2026, and the reportings will begin in October this year. So this is an adjustment phase, and even India is in negotiations with the EU as to the exact method of implementation. So the long-term plan for developing countries, that's still under consideration. Regarding equality, it's not about equality. There are equity provisions as well. One is that there is no cap on other countries on their emissions, so they are free to export even very high emissions product as well if they want to. Whereas that's not the case with the domestic market. And also default values, because and I was looking at a recent webinar by a Big Four firm, and they were explaining the impact of CBAM, and they mentioned that a lot of major corporations are considering using default values because it's difficult to actually calculate all the emissions. So it's not just outside of EU, but also within EU, there are considerations for using default values. And using of default values actually reduces your administrative burden for carbon accounting. But even if you are into the process of carbon accounting, you are in the right direction, because there's a global trend that corporations have started to account their carbon emissions, scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 as well now. So we are so if you prepare for CBAM, you are also preparing for a major global transition which is happening towards the greener economy. Thank you.
I thank the opposition side. And I now invite the government to present their reply speech.
We heard the opposition citing again the importance of the short-term effects of this policy and of the importance of acting against climate change now. The thing is, complementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism with actual plans to co-design policies, co-design economic transitions with developing countries is the best way forward. The cost that developing countries are now paying for climate change is the cost that we want them not to pay through a renovation, through a actual modification of the carbon border adjustment mechanism. We are going in the same direction, but it is exactly because the climate change issue is what we care about the most that we are saying a unilateral trade measure, as the case study from Indonesia and Malaysia with the deforestation law shows, will never bring about the green transitions that we want to trigger. That is the fundamental problem. For example, when we talked about longer term effects, we're not trying to put off the importance of climate change. We are saying if we do not take into account long-term effects, that climate change, green transition, that future that we want to go towards together will never come. For example, we have a study from Nature that confirms that actually implementing policy interventions to lower weighted average cost of capital could allow Africa to reach net zero emissions approximately 10 years earlier. We are talking about this. We have to talk about how to invest and not only subsidize these countries. For example, Malaysia and Indonesia, when we talk about the deforestation law, have said many times, we will rather have actual trade partnerships, trade opportunities, not just subsidies. And these subsidies, and this is also very important, many times are just, again, technical support, but we do not need technical support. We need capacity building. We need to get rid of, for example, international intellectual property rights, which the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change has underlined are an obstacle towards green transition. This is fundamental. Without removing this kind of segregated model, segregated model in which we have a green transition, actual research going on and concentrated in terms of capital flows, in terms of intellectual property rights in the North. We need to invest in global south. Thank you.
Thank the government. And with this, we have come to the end of our debate. I now ask our debating teams, the opposition and the government, to take their seats with the audience, perhaps in the second row over here. And now invite Dimitri, the executive director of the Geneva Trade Platform, to speak a few words.
Hello, everyone. I have nothing to say. I'm here to buy time for our judges to deliberate. I have adjudicated 2 of these debates in the past, and I think literally my one contribution to today was telling the debate team that they should have an odd number of judges, because every other time we've done this, we've deadlocked in the room and almost broken their entire event as we proceeded to have a massive fight in the green room over who won. I hope you'll join me in giving a huge round of applause to all of the debaters we saw today. I was a delegate here for a few years, and picking up the flag and speaking from the audience was one of the scariest things I've ever done in my life. The idea of coming up on this stage and being live in front of my parents while I did it is too scary for me to contemplate. So I don't understand how they just did this. And I am in awe, as I always am when I interact with Graduate Institute students. I also want to take a pause and give a huge round of applause to Shruti and her team. I cannot begin to tell you. We sprung this idea on them a few months ago, and it was only really when the WTO Secretariat confirmed that they would do this that they could begin truly working in earnest. Since then, while juggling little things like exams and sort of being young in Geneva and the Geneva summer, where for those of you from abroad, this entire city shuts down and everyone leaves, they have somehow put together some of the most comprehensive arguments about a hugely complex topic that the Committee on Trade and Environment here and thousands of conversations around the world struggle with every day. And I think they just did a phenomenal job, and the organization has just been smooth as butter. If I can make one recommendation to the WTO, timekeepers with minute countdowns would really improve the committee process. And that is something that can be taken away from this procedure. It could be an innovation that comes out of this public forum. Taking a look at my judges who are still furiously deliberating. I think we should say a huge thank you to the WTO Secretariat for considering doing this. This panel, to my knowledge, this is the first time the WTO has allowed students to debate at the public forum. I believe it's the first time this has been done. This is not like any of the other sessions happening this week. And they took a risk. They took a risk on a topic I frankly thought would be too controversial to touch, but they decided that this is a space for civil society. This is civil society, and they took a risk. I am in awe of the bravery that is required for an IO secretariat that operates under some pretty heavy constraints to take that risk. And I don't think we let them down. I will also say that, you know, this is interesting. It's a bit of fun, but it is also, I think, a reflection of the level of public communication around the CBAM. This is what it looks like when 6 Graduate Institute students, who are some of the best in the world, spend months researching CBAM and coming up with the arguments for and against. If you are from the European Commission, if you are from one of the countries concerned about CBAM, and you are looking to take the pulse of the global debate around CBAM, the state of public information, I would take note of what you heard here today, whether you agree with it, whether you disagree with it, whether you thought they made fantastic points in support of your ideas, or whether you disagree with the way they put things forward. This is the information that is out there, and this is it presented compellingly and well by young people who genuinely do believe that this is important and that the role of this institution on this important issue matters. So take from that what you will. I don't think we have definitively solved CBAM today, although if it turns out that the proposition won, someone's going to have to break it to the European Parliament. They're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Judges done? They're all looking at me. Excellent. I don't have to keep stalling for time. My dance routine is not something you want to see. So with that, let me please call Shruti back to the stage, and congratulations.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would have actually liked to watch Dimitri's dance routine, but we'll save that for the next forum. A huge congratulations to the debaters. A couple of you are first years, and I love how you didn't even come to the institute. You were still at home, wherever home was, and you still, excuse me, you still applied. You got to the applications, you went through the interviews, and really a big thank you for working through your summers for this. And to everyone over here in the audience, I know most of you are policymakers. Your living is spent on issues like this, and I really hope you come back and have a conversation with us if you think that you have anything interesting to say, which I'm sure you do. So I really encourage you to come and talk to us, or we will come and talk to you. And at the Graduate Institute, we are encouraged to keep an open mind. We will debate with you, but we will do so very civilly and respectfully. So please stick around. And now for the winners and the best speaker. Before that, I will ask every debater to come forward. I asked Dimitri to go right in front over there to give the awards. And when I call your name, please come and receive your award, and you can go back to your seat. So first up, Elena from the government side. You have your certificate and the medal over here. Well, Dimitri, I actually ask you to come right in front of you, and I will go there, and because the parents can see that. Next up, we've got Mohit from side opposition, the leader of the opposition, Mohit. Thank you, Mohit. Next up, we've got Myrtle, the Deputy Prime Minister, Myrtle. This is Myrtle's third debate, if I'm not wrong, at the Geneva debate. Thank you, Myrtle, for always being with us. Next up, we've got Vibha from side opposition, the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Vibha Sridharan. Next, we've got Muna El Wali, Government Whip. And last, we've got ANSI, Opposition Whip, ANSI. All right, now the best speaker of today's debate. It is my pleasure to announce Elena from side government. The best speaker. I'm proud to say that this is Elena's first debate and she has emerged as the best. I love that we're not running over time. And everyone at the WTO, I think you've got a lot of homework to do after this session because the winner of this debate is side government. Congratulations to the government side, the opposition side. I do encourage our audience to sit back, stay back for a while, and one of us will come talk to you. And I request our jury to come in front. We can take a little more pictures for the gram. And thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, everyone. See you next year.